Who was the greatest American president? Well, it's a subjective question, of course, and there's no one right answer. Many answers probably came out when I asked the question. Some of you probably said George Washington. He was the first and the father of the country. Thomas Jefferson, defender of individual rights, and he purchased Louisiana, which doubled the country's size. Abraham Lincoln saved the Union during the Civil War. Franklin Delano Roosevelt served the longest and led the country through two great crises, the Great Depression and the Second World War. And there are probably other answers out there too, some of you with multiple opinions, and, well, no answer's quite right. But here's one thing I'm betting. I'm betting none of you said James K. Polk. Why would I even bring up his name? Well, let's take a look at that. James K. Polk was the 11th President of the United States of America and a dark horse, someone no one ever expected to be president. He defeated Henry Clay, one of the most preeminent politicians of his day. Polk's political career had been seen as all but over when he lost the Tennessee gubernatorial race in 1843. He'd also lost it in 1841. Now, he did win in 1839, but that was getting to be 5 years ago now. Polk had been out of office for some time. He had held a regular seat in the House of Representatives years before that and for some stretch, but he was now considered on the way out. He had been Andrew Jackson's protege, but one that never seemed to really go anywhere. However, when 1844 rolled around, the Democrats were split on who to nominate for the presidency. There was a lot of fighting over those who supported slavery and those who did not, and they couldn't come to consensus on a candidate. Finally, after many ballots, dozens and dozens, Polk's name came up, and eventually they decided that he would be a decent candidate for the presidency, though many believed he'd have a hard time beating Clay. He defeated Clay with a zealous campaign and being an incredible worker. Yes, Polk would work for 16 to 18 hours every single day on almost anything he undertook. Polk's campaign did a few things extremely well. The first and foremost was to paint the Whigs, the opposition party of the day, as being destructive, as being counterproductive. If Henry Clay were elected president, the nation would basically fall apart under him. Polk made this very clear to the voters, and many voters believed him. Polk also promised things. This was a time of American expansion. Polk promised what was northern Mexico at the time would become part of the United States. In fact, what is today the American Southwest. He also promised the question of the Oregon Territory would be settled. The British and the United States disputed the territory in what is now modern-day Washington and Oregon. Polk also made one more promise not to mess with slavery. This was a time when the slavery question was really starting to heat up in the mid-1840s that would eventually lead into the Civil War. Polk promised that that would not be an issue under his presidency. With all these facets and his incredible work ethic and an incredible ability to stump speech across almost any amount of territory, Polk managed to defeat Henry Clay in 1844 and become the 11th President of the United States of America. So why even invoke James Knox Polk's name when I talk of presidential greatness? Well, here's the thing. He delivered on all his campaign promises. Very few presidents can say they did that. Yes, Polk promised he'd expand American territory into what is now the American Southwest, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, parts of Utah, and Colorado. He did that. He promised he'd settle the border with the British in Oregon. He did that as well. He said he'd lower tariffs. That happened. And he said he'd set up an independent banking system. That happened as well. Yes, Polk delivered on every campaign promise he made. He worked tirelessly, just as he had campaigned, continuing to work 16 to 18 hours every day to make sure every one of those promises he made to the American people came true. One of the real interesting facets was Polk promised to go to war. Now, American politicians rarely make that promise. They know it's against the American grain. American groups don't really like promises of war. Take American presidents who were fairly certain they would have to go to war. Abraham Lincoln, 1860. He was fairly certain there would be a civil war, but he still said he didn't want the war. He said he wanted to avoid the war. Woodrow Wilson in 1916, knowing the United States may have to get involved in World War I, said all through the election he didn't want to go to war. By 1917 he was in. Franklin Roosevelt knew the United States would probably be involved in World War II, but in 1940s he continued to say that the United States would not go to war. Lyndon Johnson as well with Vietnam. In 1964 he's running for office, continues to say the United States will not be involved in a war in Vietnam, even though it was fairly inevitable by that time. So yes, here's Polk doing something rare, promising war. And he delivered. The United States went to war with Mexico and took the territory that he wanted. So Polk is an interesting figure. Makes promises, delivers on those promises, works extremely hard, does the job. So why do I remember him as great? Why isn't Polk's name elevated? Why isn't he on Mount Rushmore? He did all these things. He did exactly what he promised. Isn't that what we want out of a president of the United States of America? Maybe not. Polk wasn't really that popular in his day, for instance. 1846, the Whigs, the opposition parties I mentioned earlier, well, they took back the House of Representatives after the Democrats had stormed in and taken both the houses of Congress and the presidency. And 1848, of course, Polk left the office. He had promised he would only serve 4 years, and he did exactly that. The Whigs won that too. So, despite Polk doing everything he promised, he just wasn't that popular. Seems strange, but that's how it worked out. Many people found they weren't quite as comfortable with what they thought they wanted from Polk. Also, Polk's legacy has left a bitter taste in the mouth of some historians. As he expanded the territory of the United States, it opened up for more slavery, something Polk, being from Tennessee, somewhat defended and was a supporter of. And so he was happy to see new states come in as slave states. And a lot of people weren't, hence we end up with the Civil War a mere 12 years after Polk left office. So yes, Polk's legacy is controversial. It leads into some of the biggest problems the United States would have in the mid-19th century. Even though he did exactly what he promised, many people just didn't see it coming, but when they saw what happened, his popularity dropped a bit. And the thing is, Polk wasn't around to defend himself. He worked so hard, working all those hours. He died a mere 3 months after leaving the office of the president. Yes, he worked himself to death. Well, that can be considered impressive in and of itself, or maybe just a touch overzealous, seeing how you look at it. So, James K. Polk is an interesting figure in American history. He is a president who did exactly what he promised. But afterwards, maybe we're not so sure that we wanted what he promised. James K. Polk, was he great? I don't know. That's for historians to decide, and it's a subjective question. Certainly fascinating, though, and that's some historical perspective.